There we go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the City of Portland Open Data Day 2022. We are very happy to have with us Katya Abazajian. She is a fellow at the Data for Impact at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. Katya has been also working in the past with a number of cities, among those Portland, Oregon, and I really admire the work that she has been doing. I follow her in social media and always try to be like in touch with everything that she's doing. So I was very happy when she accepted to join us this morning. So Katya, please, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hector. I'm so excited to speak with you all today. And I'm really excited to get to Q&A and discussion because I love talking about these topics. So I'm going to try to go somewhat quickly through my presentation. But just for a little bit of background, it seemed like from what Hector was telling me about kind of what folks wanted to learn about, a lot of the questions right now, particularly in the context of the pandemic, are around what cities should be doing with local data. And we know that data is important, that it's critical, that there's this high potential for impact, but it can be difficult to pick out exactly what to do and where to start. So hopefully I'm going to give an overview, kind of a scan of my work, and try to give some clarity to that question. And hopefully we can have a discussion about what opportunities are out there at the end of this presentation. Just for some background, I'm a fellow at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation, where I work with states and cities on open data and civic technology issues. So first, I'm going to start with a brief overview of some of the work I've done on data for recovery. So in about June 2020, I was working on a report that we thought would be really helpful for states as they started to think about recovery from the pandemic. We thought surely this first wave is going to be over, and then as soon as September comes around, we're going to start doing economic recovery work. So we got to get our report out before then. It's really funny to think back on how mistaken we were about that. But one thing that we learned just from doing research about how states were approaching pandemic recovery was that there were a lot of frustrations that were being deeply felt at the state and local level by both public servants and by residents who were trying to access services from governments. So on the public service side, there was a huge lack of data infrastructure investment that left people really shorthanded. So not enough staff to help manage the data, not enough analytical capacity to understand large amounts of data and really try to target the work that states were having to do in a more and more efficient way. And a lot of issues figuring out how to use data to streamline service delivery. So actually making operations better was hard because there wasn't that much time or resourcing for actually using the data to improve services. On the resident side, this looks a little different, and I'm sure many of you have heard this from people, that there's confusion about what is available, what's going on. People have more questions than they've ever had before, and state and local governments have really struggled to keep up with the new pace of demand for information. And a lot of the reason for that is because people are waiting a really long time for assistance that they need. I'm sure you all have seen this around rental assistance and food assistance, all kinds of things. In general, people outside of government also get the impression that there are too many cooks in the kitchen, kind of more in the context of department staffing and like departments that are responsible for different services. People can tell that agencies and departments aren't speaking to each other because they have to fill out so many different applications for support. There's ironically more than ever transparency around how difficult it is for governments to work together across departments. So all of this is outlined in a blog post that I wrote for the Beck Center on how data is critical infrastructure for disaster recovery, and you're welcome to check that out. So basically, my colleague Tyler Claycamp, who runs the State Chief Data Officers Network, and I work together on a report to synthesize a lot of these findings at the state level. And I believe Catherine Helms, who's the CDO of Oregon, is also a member of that network. So she's very intimately familiar with this work. But essentially, we interviewed a lot of folks who work adjacent to government, so subject matter experts and advocacy groups, and we did focus groups and interviews with state CDOs themselves, and we asked them what their priorities were for states to be using data in the context of economic or equitable recovery from the pandemic. We also analyzed state of the state addresses from 2020. Although they were pre-pandemic, so they weren't as insightful, but we did try to do a scan of how many governors actually mentioned data in their state of the state addresses at all, and very few do. I'm sure many of you won't be surprised to hear that, but very few executive officials are super aware of how much data infrastructure is required to make our states run smoothly. So that's why we wanted to lean into kind of highlighting the really essential use cases that we found that elected officials, that legislators, and that decision makers and state and local kind of government champions need to be aware of if they're going to actually invest appropriately in data infrastructure. So what this report does is highlights some of the major challenges for chief data officers. So what are they facing? And again, I share these because I imagine that a lot of these are similar to what many of you are dealing with at the local level. But for example, chief data officers say that there's very little time for metadata in the middle of a crisis. So a lot of those like data management best practices that make open data possible or that make it possible for us to use data well kind of go out the window in a crisis. We heard that. A lot of the data systems that people were using to pull out data about the effects of the pandemic or about the effects of certain socioeconomic disparities weren't actually even capable of disaggregating by race or ethnicity. So a lot of the emerging discourse around how we use data isn't hard-coded. It's just hardwired not to happen based on the legacy systems that a lot of states were using. A lot of budget deficits are targeting kind of data and IT infrastructure right now at the state level. So many CDO offices are getting smaller when they should be getting bigger. And a lot of states are juggling really hard to manage legacy data systems like integrated data systems or really complex interagency data sharing infrastructure. And that's actually something that has hamstrung a lot of folks. So while it's really enticing sometimes to build integrated data systems that have like all the bells and whistles of strong data sharing, it's promised to like improve collaboration 100-fold or whatever. A lot of the time, those really big data systems are not actually the most necessary option, and they're a lot of time and energy to maintain. So we try to kind of gear the recommendations in our report to that issue in particular and make sure that the solutions we're proposing are as lightweight as possible. So yeah, biasing toward just data as needed, not data for the sake of data. And then finally, we also heard that many states have struggles with kind of identifying the correct legal mechanisms or data sharing protections to use when handling personal data. And that's something that emerges as a bigger and bigger problem as you do start to join data across departments more. So it's one of the kind of things to be aware of is if that's a solution area that you're interested in. I would definitely recommend that everyone go read the report to learn about all the specific use cases that we highlighted. We have a number of different issue areas that we focused on, like, sorry, this title is wrong, but it's workforce and education use cases, but we also have health and benefits use cases, as well as budget reallocation use cases, and education, and housing issues and other neighborhood well-being issues. So there are a number of other use cases covered in the report that I would recommend you check out. But this is just an example of some of the specific use cases that we highlighted. So in the area of workforce and education, for example, we saw a lot of states testing out ways to combine their higher education data with industry and labor statistics data to understand if the colleges and higher education institutions in their state are actually meeting the demands of the industry in that state. A lot of states were working on joining workforce development data with other social benefits data to understand if, for example, someone who's applying for unemployment benefits might be eligible for a new workforce development program, because those data systems in a lot of places haven't been linked, and that's really essential work that can help get people back on their feet after a crisis. There are a variety of other use cases reflected here. You can see we went very broad, but we tried to isolate the specific solutions or use case areas where states could really lean into improving the available data, the data that's available publicly, and also the data that they're sharing with across agencies and with their trusted partners. So this has all been under the umbrella of the State Chief Data Officers Network. The Roadmap to Recovery is just one resource that we've put together for State Chief Data Officers. And as I mentioned, Oregon is a participant in that network. So we do kind of ask a little bit of a lot of the time of our state CDO participants so that they can kind of help us develop better resources, but we hope that we share that knowledge back and give folks really specific opportunities that they can use to advocate for more investment in data projects and data infrastructure in their states. So I welcome everyone to check out the network, and feel free to reach out if you would like to learn more about how to collaborate with states on that level. I know that Oregon is leading the way in some of the aspects of kind of state and local collaboration. And so I don't feel that I have a ton to offer on that front, because a lot of other states are looking to Oregon to understand how states and cities can work better together. But as always, we're very open to hearing from folks and collaborating on state and local issues. So that kind of brings me to my next category, where this section of my work around the State Chief Data Officers Network was very oriented around recovery and making sure that data is used for the most critical functions. But there's also an opportunity to use open data for experimentation, for building things that are new, within reason, kind of experimenting in ways that can actually make community members feel more empowered, that can actually solve problems that community members are asking for. And that's some of the work that I'm most excited about. So I know that you all have heard a little bit about open data so far, so I'm not going to go deeply into this slide, but I just wanted to kind of frame the point that a lot of what is kind of high impact potential open data work is the work that takes on a kind of emerging view of how open data can be used. So in the past, open data has definitely been something that had to be published because of freedom of information laws, or that could be proactively published to avoid getting public information requests, or just that could be that a lot of the previous kind of in the second wave of open data and in the history of open data at this point, a lot of the talking points around why it matters have been around giving businesses or community organizations access to information that could allow them to do great things. So publishing that data in bulk. A lot of governments have experimented with that, and most governments have passed open data policies, which are really important, and published open data portals. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the open data that they're publishing is going to be used impactfully. And that's what I've heard from state and local governments for a long time now, that just because the data is out there, it doesn't mean someone's going to use it. And that can be a really difficult thing when you've spent a lot of time and energy trying to make sure that that data gets out. But what we've tried to do, and what I'm trying to do through some of my current work, is taking a more purpose-directed approach so that while you're in the process of publishing open data, you incorporate strategies that help you understand who's going to use that data, what they might use it for, and how you can adapt the data itself in order to be more useful to those people before you publish it. So impactful reuse is a huge part of what I think informs the potential for experimentation with open data. And one way in which I'm working on a project that helps cities experiment with open data is through the Opportunity Project for Cities, which is a 20-week design sprint that cities can participate in, where we help them assemble a sprint team. And the sprint team is composed of a city government team, a tech volunteer team, a community partner team, and product advisors provided by us at the kind of program facilitation level. So for this, we originally tested out this model last year with the cities of San Jose and St. Paul, and they both chose community partners that worked in the housing issue area. So they chose a housing problem area focus. We were able to secure the support of volunteers from google.org. So each sprint team has embedded technologists who are required to kind of listen to both the city team and the community team and help them isolate what challenges are most pressing that can be addressed with open source technology. And then we have product advisors who are experienced in open source tech and civic technology that can kind of help all these really different folks work together to build tools that use open data to address really pressing issues. So this past year was the first time that we tried out this model. And we obviously designed this framework with a lot of different kind of learning areas in mind. This is really difficult work to do. If anyone's tried to do kind of cross-sectoral collaboration projects like this in the past, it can be really difficult because folks are coming from completely different cultural kind of expectations in the workplace, even down to like how you run a meeting can be really difficult when you're working with people coming from the tech industry and others coming from the housing nonprofit world, and then city government folks who are used to leading the meetings and being in charge and having their voices heard. And in this model, we really try to set up a structure where the sprint team's roles would be defined by the entire sprint team at the start of the process, so that it wasn't just assumed that city government is asking for a product from the tech team or that city government is asking for feedback from a community partner. We wanted everyone to feel like equal components of this team. And that felt like a really important piece of making sure that the open data that's applied is used well, so that community members actually have meaningful representation in the design and implementation of the tool that eventually gets built. So the process itself involves, and this is a process that's open that we've published in a toolkit that I'll talk more about in a minute, which is why I'm sharing it with you all, because anyone can replicate this process and learn from what we've done. So the process starts with choosing a problem and assembling the sprint team that I mentioned. And in this phase, we usually encourage folks to start doing some data inventorying work, start reviewing the quality of their data, and start cleaning and processing that data, because I'm sure if any one of you work with data, you know how long that process can be. The first phase of the project is understanding the problem. So we really encourage teams to spend a good amount of time conducting interviews with community members, doing focus groups, benefiting from the UX design experience of their tech volunteers, and really kind of taking a very embedded tech design approach by getting people who are on the ground, both at the community partner and at the city, to be a key part of that process and informing what they know of what actually matters to communities. So that knowledge gets incorporated into a co-creation and ideation phase in the second phase, where each of the sprint partners get together to come up with potential solutions based on all of the problems that they've heard. And in this section, we're talking more specifically about finding high value data from the data inventory, processing it, and starting to look at linkages and starting to look at how useful that data could be if it was published through a tech tool. So there's a little bit of chicken and egg work that happens that I'm sure folks have some experience with, but it can be hard to build a tool when you know that the data is not that great, and it might make you want to build a different type of tool. So that type of thing happens, but we do leave a lot of space for kind of iterative development and making sure that as we learn new information, we're ready to pivot the team at any time so that the data product that gets built is something that actually reflects the real needs of the community and what's actually being surfaced in the user research. So toward the end of the program, we have some time allocated for teams to do a pilot run of their prototype. They're able to do some user testing. They're able to publish some of the initial data through the tool. And that's kind of the opportunity for us also to start talking to people about long-term updates to usability, for example, or the sustainability of the product itself, since we know that the extent to which a tech tool, or the length that a tech tool survives at the city, can make a difference in how much the community trusts the city to build new innovative tools. It's a very precarious thing. And so we're very conscious of making sure that these tech tools are sustainable, that they're open source, that they're accessible, and that community members have an opportunity to provide feedback as they go. So the city of St. Paul ended up working with a private partner called Shelter App and convincing the company to open source some of their code so that the city could build its own instance. And the tech team was able to build this app, which you see processes data in a very user-friendly way. So the data that's behind this app obviously is maps of where emergency shelters exist. And that includes photos of the shelters, which was something that came out in the user research that community members or people who were on the verge of experiencing homelessness or currently experiencing it were looking to understand, like, where am I actually going? What does it look like? Is it going to be nice? And that's kind of, it's a really important thing for providing people with dignity and a dignified experience when they're seeking shelter. And so this app includes things that were specifically asked for by the people who are going to be using these shelters, in that they wanted bus routes and they wanted photos of where they're going to be going. And that all counts as public data that the city was able to share because they worked in collaboration with their partners in the continuum of care for housing services. And all of those kind of small user research details went into making this tool that leverages open data in a way that's very simple and minimal and accessible. The city of San Jose also developed a kind of rental assistance tool related to housing because they knew that their users were struggling with kind of understanding the expectations of what they might receive if they apply for rental assistance. There was kind of like a form previously that they might get access to if they had access to a housing nonprofit or a community partner that would help them fill out the application, but otherwise was generally not super accessible. So the city worked with its Sprint team to develop this rental assistance tool, which you'll see on the button. You can see what you may qualify for. That was kind of the place where they included estimates of how much people with similar conditions had gotten in rental assistance before. So that's another way in which open data was reflected, not as bulk open data that's downloadable, but something that's really targeted that meets a need that someone had asked for, which is, if I apply, how much assistance can I even expect? And it used the data from their application to calculate the average based on what the city had about previous rental assistance. So this is an old screenshot. Both teams are still working on the final iterations of their project, of their prototypes, because we do encourage them to go through as many iterations as possible to make sure that the prototype is going to be impactful when it's released. So both of these are probably changed from the screenshots that I have, but I definitely encourage you to keep an eye on these projects and continue to engage with the Top Cities project. So what's next for us? We right now are launching our second cohort of cities. So we actually have an application process open that you can find on the Opportunity Project for Cities website. But unfortunately, it's only open to cities that are in the Knight Foundation community because that's our major funder right now. We are very open to partnering with community foundations or other funders who are interested in supporting city governments to participate in the sprint. And we would likely incorporate cities that have their own funding, for example, or who are able to connect us with local funding to future iterations of the cohort. But at this point, we are just looking at a couple of cities, 4 cities to be precise, to add in this next iteration from the Knight community. But as I mentioned before, you can follow along through the Opportunity Project for Cities toolkit and use any of the resources in there that are helpful to you. I think that kind of all of these experiments, while they're really exciting, sometimes can feel like playing whack-a-mole, trying to build apps and tools for every single issue that we see arising in cities. And so I also like to zoom out a little bit and think about kind of where we are with the state of technology and data in cities. And I'm just going to go really quickly through this because I realize I spoke way longer than I intended. But the civic tech community has been around for a number of years now. And many of us have been using open data to try to build tools for a long time with very mixed results. And it's time to start thinking a little bit more systemically about the role of data and technology in cities and communities. There are people out there who are building things that are embedded with local community organizing efforts or with community actions. And those are the civic tech tools that I find are the most compelling and most meaningful. So for example, Who Owns What in New York City is a tool that's built by the Housing Data Coalition to help identify landlords that are owners of buildings so that people can take direct action on holding those landlords accountable for things like code violations or exploitation or discriminatory practices. And so a lot of my work to date or in recent time has been around building kind of the constraints of what good civic tech is. And that means really taking an embedded approach to building technology and applying data. So I recently started a newsletter called Civic Source, which is a newsletter about the ways local governments use data and technology to shape communities. And my goal in that newsletter is to surface kind of all of the data improvements or open data opportunities or kind of small, maybe systemic things behind the scenes that people may not realize are actually impacting the way that communities experience life. So I highly encourage everyone to subscribe to that if that's of interest to you. And I will end it there to maybe salvage whatever minutes we have left.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the presentation. I think people are very interested, and I share some links in the chat as well. Well, with that, we end the recording.